Hey folks, Scott here from OMM, and today we're going to be covering the stuff we did in lab last week, which is cervical diagnosis. I got my man Skelly over here. Skelly's going to help me out in going through some of the specifics of cervical biomechanics and diagnosis, and we're going to talk specifically. First, we're going to go through the AA joint, that is the atlantoaxial joint. We're going to talk anatomy, biomechanics, diagnosis. We're going to do the same thing then for typical cervicals, and then for the OA. So, Skelly, you ready to get started? Yeah, whatever. Yeah. So the first thing we're going to talk about is some anatomy, right? We're going to start. We're going to kind of go in a weird order. We're going to start with the atlantoaxial joint, and then we're going to do the typical cervicals, and then lastly we're going to do the occipito-atlantal joint. Okay, so starting with the atlantoaxial joint, also known as the AA joint. So this is the atlas, right, and this is the axis, right? The atlas is this oddly shaped bone. I want you to notice something about the atlas, right? Important thing is that unlike all the other vertebra in the spine, really, the atlas does not have a spinous process. See, these are the spinous processes. The atlas doesn't have one. Instead, it has kind of just a little bump here that's called the posterior tubercle. So that's important to note about the axis. Atlas, I should say, rather. Now, the axis is this one right here. The axis is actually a very prominent spinous process, but most notably, the most important feature of the axis is actually the dens. It's kind of hard to see, but it's deep in there. You can see where that little spring is. Right behind that spring is the dens. The dens actually rises from the axis up into the atlas. And the atlas actually spins on that process like that and takes the head with it, right? So, therefore, the atlantoaxial joint, which is the atlas on the axis, the primary motion of that joint is rotation, right? AA, primary motion, rotation. In fact, hardly any other movement really happen at the AA joint. So, and at least any motions that do happen there are clinically insignificant, right? So all we care about at the AA joint is rotation, right? That's the only thing that we care about. Now, what does that mean? It means that when we are moving, right, we can really only move our AA joint in rotation, but it also means that dysfunction at the AA joint only occurs in rotation, okay? And that's important to note. All right, so that's the anatomy of the AA joint. Okay, so now let's talk about how we actually go about diagnosing the AA, okay? So, once again, the AA only rotates, right? That's the only movement that we care about at the atlantoaxial joint, okay? So, how do we test motion at the atlantoaxial joint? We're only going to be testing it in rotation. Now, there's two ways to test motion at the atlantoaxial joint, right? They're very similar. In fact, they're really identical. It's just a matter of personal preference, okay? What we're going to do, we're going to take our hands, right? We're going to put our hands on the side, towards the back, but mostly on the side of the skull, right? Our fingers are going to kind of wrap around the back at what's called the occipital shelf, right? Here is where the occiput sits on the atlas, right? Our fingers just kind of wrap around there from the side towards the back, right? And I'm just going to hold our hands comfortably there. Our thumbs kind of resting around the ear, so the ear is around here somewhere. Our fingers kind of resting around the ear. And what we're going to do is take our patient into rotation, okay, from this neutral position, right? Not flexed nor extended, no side bending, just from this neutral position, we're going to take our patient into rotation. Leftward rotation and rightward rotation, okay? And what we're doing is feeling for a resistance on one side compared to the other. We're going to feel a resistance as in like something is preventing us from taking the head into rotation towards one side versus the other side. So it might feel easier to take the head towards one side than towards the other side, right? So we're feeling for that. Now, the issue that I have with this is that, and it's not bad because again, the AA is responsible for most of the rotation of the cervical spine. However, we're not really isolating the AA in this position, because when we do this, we're engaging some of these lower cervicals when we take the patient into rotation from a neutral position like this, right? So the other way of diagnosing the AA, simply enough, you're going to take their patient into full flexion, okay? And when we take our patients into full flexion, it's much more difficult to rotate the inferior division vertebra, the typical cervicals down here. It's much more difficult to rotate them when they're flexed, okay? So that allows us to isolate the AA a little more, because remember, the AA doesn't really do much flexing or extending. So it's not affected by this full flexion. So we can properly isolate the AA by taking your patient into rotation to both sides, right, in full flexion, and now we've eliminated the possibility of cervicals really contributing as much to that rotation. And therefore we can really diagnose the AA and not have interference from the typical cervicals. Now, what's important is that, and this is for all treatments, so I'm saying it now, but it applies to every single OMM diagnosis you will do, right? You need to remember that when we're testing for restrictive barriers, we need to reach a barrier, right? If we are just kind of be like, oh yeah, rotation that way, this way, okay, I'm feeling feel a little different on one side. That's not you're not taking the patient into a barrier when you're doing this. That is a barrier, right? That is a barrier, not this, right? A lot of people, especially incoming first years, new people that are new to OMM, you're just gonna kind of be afraid to engage the barrier, right? You are going to feel when you can't go anymore, right? But you have to be confident in that, right? Your patient will tell you if this is now getting too tight. Or you can ask them, is that too tight? And they'll say, no, I can keep going, or you can keep going, right? So you want to take them to the barrier. You will not be able to know if you've hit a barrier until you've hit the barrier, okay? So don't be afraid to take them there, okay? So that's how you diagnose the AA. Remember, we diagnose based on the ease, okay? Another important thing, right? So back with the AA, right? If we felt resistance to the left, that means that the ease is to the right, and that's our diagnosis. Why? Because we diagnose based on what the body is doing, right? That's what a diagnosis is. What is the body doing at that particular point in time? Any resistance that you're feeling is only a result of the position that the body is in, or that segment of the body is in. It's a result of that, right? So if your vertebra is rotated left, that's why you have resistance, restriction, and rotating it to the right, right? So when we diagnose, we always diagnose based on the ease, which is what the body, the position that the body likes to be in, that is in at that point in time, right? All right, now let's talk about the actual nomenclature that you need to know how to write, especially when it comes to practical exams, right? You're all gonna have to do this, okay? So obviously we're starting first with the AA. The AA is super simple, right? Because the only thing that we care about with the AA is rotation, right? So let's say we found that the AA is restricted on the right, right? We're turning the head, it's restricted on the right. What is your diagnosis? Well, again, we diagnose based on the ease, what the AA is doing that's causing that rotation to the restriction, right? So in this case, it's restricted to the right because the AA is rotated to the left. Very simply, the way we write AA diagnoses is simply writing A, and then we write R for rotation and the direction in which it is rotated. So if there's a restriction on the right, we're going to write a little letter here. That means left. It is rotated to the left, right? And it's that simple, right? I can throw this at you in a couple of different ways, right? I can say on an exam, once again, there's you fully flex the patient and you take them to the right in rotation and you feel resistance. What's the diagnosis? In which case, this is it. AA, rotated left. Or I could say, you take your patient to full flexion or not. So you have your patient in neutral and you rotate them to the left and feel no resistance or feel the ease towards the left, or something like that. In which case, once again, this would be the answer, right? That's the ease, rotation to the left. Okay. If there's restriction on the left, then the diagnosis would be A, rotation right. That simple. Okay, so that is the AA. Okay, folks, we're back to anatomy now, and now we're going to talk about the typical cervicals. Okay, so the typical cervicals, when it comes to joints, include the axis on C3, C3 on C4, C4 on C5, and so on until we reach C7 down here. So C7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right? So all of these are called the typical cervical joints, right? And what that means is they follow a very specific motion, right? And the motion that we discuss when we're considering typical cervical joints is side bending and rotation happening to the same side, right? So the typical cervical joints are capable of rotating and side bending and flexing and extending, and they're capable of being maintained in a neutral position, right? But the most important part about all of that is that for the typical cervicals, rotation and side bending happen to the same side, right? So now, what are the important landmarks when it comes to the typical cervicals? Well, obviously we have the spinous processes, and you can see that the spinous processes of most, maybe not all, but most of the typical cervicals are bifid. They have two kind of prongs, two heads, if you will. So that's kind of a distinguishing characteristic of only the cervical spine. The thoracic spine does not have bifid spinous processes, right? In case you're wondering, I am in fact once again straddling the skeleton in order to get this shot. So, please withhold all judgment. This is in the name of science. Okay, so the important anatomy, a more important anatomy with involved with typical cervicals is where we're going to be diagnosing, like what functional parts of the cervical anatomy, typical cervical anatomy, we're going to be using for diagnosing. So the first part that we're going to be using is, for at least the rotational form of diagnosis, is the articular pillars, right? So to give you an example of what the articular pillars are, I want you to notice that these right here, right, are the articular facets, right, the superior and inferior articular facets, and they meet at what's called the zygapophyseal joints, and all of these facets are sort of aligned in a column that goes all the way down the cervical spine. This column is made up of the articular pillars, right? So the articular pillars are these columns on either side, right? Right? And so we are going to be using these columns that are located, I would say, about a centimeter, maybe a smidge more away on both sides from the bifid spinous processes, right? So this is here, about a centimeter off here, about a centimeter off here, and that's where we're going to be placing our fingers, okay? But again, that's the functional important anatomy when it comes to diagnosing typical cervicals with the rotational model, which we'll discuss in a second. Now, there's another important landmark, right, with the spinous process, with the typical cervicals, and that's the transverse processes, right? The transverse processes are these right here. These are the transverse processes of the cervical vertebrae. Now, where are they in reference to other things? Well, they're pretty much directly located underneath the mastoid process, right? So here is the external auditory meatus. The mastoid process is the bone just behind that. If you follow that downwards, you're going to be just in line with the transverse process, and we'll talk about that a little more later. All right, now let's talk about how to diagnose the typical cervicals, okay? So, unlike the AA, where we're doing a lot of motion with the entire head moving back and forth, we're not going to be doing as much motion with the, whole neck, if you will, and head, right, with typical cervicals. Typical cervicals is going to involve static palpation and motion testing of individual vertebra, right? So how do we do it? Okay, well, the first thing we want to do is make sure we have proper placement of ourselves and the patient, right? So just like AA, and again, I mentioned this before, but you want to make sure you are comfortable when you have your patient position. So your patient is supine, like Skelly over here, and you want to be in a position where if you're too high up, you got to be bending over to properly diagnose, right? That's uncomfortable. If you're too low down and your arms are up here to try and do, that's uncomfortable. So some people like to do it sitting like this, where they're just simply comfortable, right? You can sit up straight. Their arms are slightly bent at the elbows, right? Their wrists are bending, comfortably, right, at the table, right? Some other people like the table higher and they do it standing up, and that's fine as well. Whatever works for you. Okay, so you're in this comfortable position. You are going to then, there are two ways to do this. One, you can have your patient just resting their head on the table, and you can just reach your hands in and palpate their neck as your patient is lying comfortably supine. Or you can take the heels of your hand, right? Heels of your hand. You can take it under the occiput and slightly add a little bit of flexion, just enough to get your hands under there, and have your patient kind of rest their head on the heels of your hand. Then you're going to take any one of your fingers. It's best to use either your first or second finger. Your second or third finger. That is your index or middle finger, right? And using that to palpate those articular pillars, right? And again, you find the spinous process, and then you're going to go about a centimeter lateral on both sides. And at that point, you have to feel through the muscle that is undoubtedly existing between your fingers and the articular pillars. You have to feel through that, and you will feel the kind of boniness underneath the musculature, right? And then, so this is one model for diagnosing. What we're going to do, first thing you do is just place your fingers there. You're not applying any force or anything. You're just placing your fingers there, with an even amount of pressure. No force, just kind of holding your fingers there. And you're just seeing if one vertebra is rotated. If you feel, or maybe I should say, if you feel a prominence on one side or the other, on one articular pillar or the other, right? If you feel a prominence on one side or the other, that could mean that the articular pillar on that side is more posterior, or that is closer to the table, right? Further superficial towards your finger. It could also mean that that's musculature in the way, right? We're not going to worry about the difference right now because there's nothing we can do about it at this stage in the game when you're just diagnosing. So again, I just want you to appreciate that static palpation may give you an indication that there might be a prominence caused by a vertebral rotation, but it could also be caused by, musculature being hypertonic, being tense, right? So that's the first thing. We're just placing our fingers there and statically palpating. Then, we are not done. So we're not done at that point. Next, we need to motion test, right? Everything here is involving motion testing, right? So we are then going to take our fingers and press, alternating in an anterior to posterior course, right? So my fingers are underneath the neck like this, and I'm going to be doing this with my fingers, either my middle finger or with my pointer finger. I'm doing this. I'm alternating. I'm pressing upwards, right? One after the other, right? I don't want to press both up like this because that's not rotating, right? So pressing up like this, one at a time. And if you can appreciate the vertebra rotating, that's kind of what we're going for. So when I press up with my left finger, the vertebra is rotating towards the right. I'm pushing it up with my left side towards the right. If I press with my right hand, my right finger I should say, upwards, it's going to rotate the vertebra towards the left, right? The vertebra itself will be rotating to the left, okay? Now, the question is, unlike in the OA, which the OA has to be either flexed or extended, the cervical spine can be dysfunctional in neutral position, but it can also still be dysfunctional in flexion and extension. This is a neutral position. We can find dysfunction in neutral, but we have to evaluate in either flexion or extension to decide if dysfunction exists there, right? So let's say I'm at, C3 right now, and I'm palpating, right? And I'm doing motion testing, and I feel a dysfunction. The next step is to take the next step that I use is to take the person into flexion to that vertebral level, in this case C3, and check to see if this dysfunction either gets better in flexion, gets worse in flexion, or doesn't change at all. If it gets better in flexion, if the dysfunction just disappears in flexion, then we found where the ease is, right? That's where the dysfunction goes away. That's where the person's vertebra likes to be, and therefore we don't feel that resistance anymore. Therefore, if that's happening in flexion, then we know the ease is in flexion. If it gets worse in flexion, if we lift the patient up, we feel a dysfunction in neutral, we lift the patient up and we feel like, oh God, it got even worse, it's even more prominent on the left or whatever, then that means that that's where the restriction is. The barrier is most prominent in that inflection, which means that the ease is therefore in extension. Okay? Now, if you take the person into flexion and nothing changes, then that means that it's a neutral dysfunction. It means the person, their dysfunction exists in neutral. Okay? So once again, if it gets worse in flexion, that means the ease is in extension. That's your diagnosis. If it gets better in flexion, that means that's where your ease is, and so flexion is the ease. And if it's not different at all in flexion, then your dysfunction is in neutral. Okay? Right? Okay. So that's one way of diagnosing the typical cervicals. The other way of diagnosing the typical cervicals is by using the transverse processes. Okay? So how do we do that? Well, the transverse processes we said are located right here beneath the mastoid process, right? And what we're going to do is we're going to have our patient just kind of sitting here in neutral. You can support their head if you want, but you're going to take your fingers and you're going to be pushing now like this from left to right with your fingers on the transverse processes, and we're going to be translating them, right? So instead of now doing this motion on the articular pillars, we're going to be on the transverse processes, and we're going to be doing this motion like that, left to right, right? So if we feel a resistance in translation from left to right, right, that means there is restriction towards right translation. Well, that requires us to define what translation is first then, right? So what is translation? Okay? Translation is when you translate someone, you're essentially side bending them, but in an interesting way, right? So let's say, my head right now, this would be for me, a right translation, right? But I want you to observe what's really happening here, right? If you ignore what's going on with my neck, the angle of my head on my neck, right, is the same thing as side bending to the left. So I'm translated to the right, but the angle of my head on my neck, if I were to straighten out my neck like this, right, can you appreciate that's left side bending? Once again, right translation is the same thing as left side bending, right? So, therefore, if we feel resistance in translation to the right, it's the same thing as saying that's resistance in side bending to the left. So the ease, therefore, is side bending to the right. Okay? Shortcut, just think wherever side I feel resistance in translation, that's the ease of side bending. So a shortcut, if I feel resistance in translation to the right, the neck is side bent right. Right? The restriction in side bending is to the left, but the ease is to the right. Okay? So just make sure you can differentiate what translation is, okay? And we would do that for the typical cervicals all the way down, right? Transverse processes, translation, right? The reason why I don't typically do that, a lot of people don't typically use translations, because it's a little more uncomfortable. The transverse processes tend to naturally be a little tender, right? And it's some generally more uncomfortable, kind of feeling for your patients. So I typically stick to the rotational model. But for completion, that's the way we would do it. And again, you would have to take your patient into flexion, translate them on the transverse processes in flexion, and again, same rules as applies for before from the rotational model. Okay? So now how do we write out our diagnoses for the typical cervicals? Okay? Well, what did we say about typical cervicals, right? They always side bend and rotate to the same side, right? However, they can do it in flexion, and they can do it in extension, and they can do it in neutral. Okay? So let's say we'll start out simple, right? You're palpating C5, right, on your patient. And your patient is in neutral. You feel a prominence on the left articular pillar, I should say, just to the left of the spinous process. Any of those would work. Prominence. If I said if there's a prominence on the left, I can say the left side is more posterior. I can say the left side is more shallow. In fact, let me write these down, right? So I can say left articular pillar is, I can say, prominent. I could say posterior. I can say shallow. Or I could say superficial. They all mean the same thing, right? All of them are saying that this particular vertebra, in this case C5, is rotated to the left, because when a vertebra is rotated to the left, its articular pillar on the left side will pop out posteriorly. So you could say the left articular pillar is prominent. It's posterior, that is closer to the table if you're diagnosing supine, right? It's shallow, where the opposite is deep, right? And so therefore shallow and superficial are synonyms, right? So all of these terms I could put on a test, and you will see them on your exams in the fall and in the spring and all over. Right? They will try and trip you up with these words. Please know all of them. Okay? Obviously, there's also the alternative. I could also say the left articular pillar is not prominent. That's kind of, probably wouldn't say that. But I could say a left articular pillar is anterior compared to the right. I could say a left articular pillar is deep compared to the right. That would mean the opposite. That would mean the right side. It's rotated to the right, I should say. Right? So the way it's written here, left articular pillar, prominent, posterior, shallow, superficial, what does it mean? It means the vertebra is rotated to the left, right? Which means what? It means it's also side bent to the left. Now, the question is it in neutral, flex, or extended, right? How do we tell? So in the question stem, I'll say you're testing your patient in neutral, you find the dysfunction at C5, the left articular pillar is more posterior. You then take that particular unit into flexion, and the dysfunction goes away. Okay? What's the diagnosis? If it goes away in flexion, that's where its ease is. So you're going to write your diagnosis like this. Let's say in this case it is C5. The ease, we said, it goes away in flexion, so it has to be flexed. And we said it was rotated left and side bent left. Important nomenclature rule, you're not going to be responsible for differentiating this on the exam, but you will get docked for this in practical exams, right? For the typical cervicals, and also in the thoracic spine, but we'll get there. When it's in flexion and extension, we always write rotation first. I don't really know why. Probably means rotation is more important in flexion and extension than in neutral compared to side bending. I don't know, but we're going to write rotation, in this case rotated left, before side bending, in this case side bending left. Okay, so this will be the diagnosis if I said the left articular is more prominent and flexion is ease. Okay, so if I said flexion ease and the left articular was more prominent, that's the diagnosis, right? If I said C5, right? However, what if I said in flexion there was no difference, right? There was no change when I put it in flexion. Then what's the diagnosis? Everything else being the same. Well, now it would be C5 neutral, but now in neutral, side bending is more important. So we write side bending first. Side bend left, rotated left. Okay, so again, neutral, we write side bending first. Rotation, we write flexion or extension, we write rotation first. Okay? Now, I could also say, instead of saying what the articular pillar is doing, I could say, what the translation is like, or the rotation motion itself. I could say, instead of the left articular pillar is prominent, I can say restriction in right rotation. Right? Yeah, it means the restriction is in rotation to the right, which once again means that the vertebra is rotated to the left. That's where the ease is. All of this means the same thing. I'll get rid of this so it's not confusing. All of this is referring to the same thing, right? I could also say ease in left rotation, or I can say restriction in left translation, right? You should know by now, again, left translation restriction means that there's right side bending restriction, which means the ease is in left side bending, which is the diagnosis we have here, right? So all of these things, I don't need to give you all this, I just need to give you one for you to determine what the diagnosis is. So you should be familiar with all of these terms when it comes to the typical cervicals, okay? And once again, if I said that inflection, it got worse, that means that the ease is an extension, right? So make sure you can differentiate flexion, neutral, and extended, okay? All right, so the last bit of anatomy we have to cover in this cervical diagnosis lab is the anatomy of the occipito-atlantal joint, okay? So the occipito-atlantal joint is the point at which the occiput, which is the back of the skull, articulates with the atlas. It kind of has this kind of artificial, thing in here just to kind of connect the skull, but really this kind of sits directly on there, where these are the occipital condyles right here on either side, and they sit inside the superior articular facets of the atlas, right? Notice that the atlas has these very wide-reaching transverse processes. We're going to be using those as well in diagnosis, potentially, if you'd like that model of diagnosis. Okay? So the occipito-atlantal joint moves in all planes, but it moves in a very different way that makes it one of the atypical vertebrae, just like the AA, right? Two atypical joints are the OA and the AA, right? Those are the only two atypical joints, right? And so the OA is also capable of flexion and extension. In fact, it is the primary motion of the OA is flexion and extension of the occiput on the atlas, right? That's why we call the OA the yes joint, while the AA, because it's solely rotation, we call it the no joint, right? Because those are the motions of nodding your head and shaking your head, respectively. So the primary motions of the OA are flexion and extension, while it also is capable of side bending, right? Side bending and rotation, right? However, they're the secondary motions, not as significant. And of the two, of side bending and rotation, side bending is the more significant of the two. In fact, they say that rotation is actually just a consequence of side bending at the OA. So because of that, when we do our diagnosis nomenclature, as we will see soon, we always write side bending first before rotation. But obviously flexion and extension is primary motion. We write that before all of it. So that's really the important anatomy of the OA. All right, now we're going to be diagnosing the OA, the occipito-atlantal joint, right? So, as we just said, the OA, primary motion is flexion and extension, secondary motion side bending, which induces rotation to the opposite side, right? So, how do we diagnose the OA? Well, once again, the OA flexes and extends, but it happens strictly around the occipito-atlantal joint, right? Any other flexion beyond what's happening in the occipito-atlantal joint, we don't want to deal with, we don't care about, right? So we want to isolate flexion and extension at the OA. So what I want you to imagine with your patient is, imagine you send like a pole through their external auditory meatuses, right? Through their ear canal on both sides, right? Imagine all flexion and extension occurring around that axis, right? So if there's a pole through here, right, extension and flexion is just happening through that hole, right here where my forefinger is, right? And that's flexion. That's the limit to flexion extension. It's not much, right? Because everything else will involve cervicals, right? So you really shouldn't have to lift your patient's head off the table very much in flexion. It should really just be a chin moving down, right? Or chin moving up, just a bit. So how do we hold the head? Well, again, we're going to hold the head like this. We're going to have the palms of our hands along the back towards the sides of of each head, right, just like the AA. We're then going to wrap our thumb and forefinger, our index, around the ears on both sides, and our other fingers are going to come around and sit on the occipital shelf, right, where the occiput meets the atlas. And that's going to allow us to really isolate extension and flexion and side bending and rotation. Now, side bending and rotation on the OA, it has to happen such that the side bending specifically, we're not going to be using rotation, just mainly side bending, and then we're going to extrapolate rotation from side bending. But we have to make sure that the side bending is being isolated at the OA, just like we did with flexion and extension. So how do we do that? Well, what we're going to do is draw an imaginary axis. I'm going to take this. We're going to draw an imaginary axis through the nose, right through the base of the nose, right there. Okay, so if we were to draw an axis right through the nose, imagine all side bending happening through that axis, right? If I were to side bend, imagine that, so notice how the nose, see if I can zoom out a little bit, notice how the nose area is not really veering from midline when I do this, right? I'm kind of isolating it so that all side bending is happening through this, that twisting around this axis, right? Right, so it's not much. It's not much at all, right? And that's really all the OA is responsible for when it comes to side bending. So when we take our patient, this is one of the ways of diagnosing the OA, when we take our patient into OA side bending, that's all we're going to be doing, is rotating them just kind of like that, all right? Or side bending them like that, I should say. Okay, so there are 4 different quadrants, if you will, that we can put our patient in, right? The OA can be flexed, side bent left, or side bent right, or it can be extended, side bent left, side bent right. And once again, we're going to take our patient into all 4 of those quadrants, decide which one has the most restriction, and then we're going to pick the opposite diagnosis. So you're going to put them into those different locations, and then we're going to decide where the restriction is, or you can decide if you want where it's easiest, and then pick where the ease is for the diagnosis. That's one way of diagnosing OA. The other way is using translation, right? So we already talked about translation when we talked about typical cervicals, but now when it comes to the OA, we're literally, instead of using the transverse processes of anything, we are literally going to be taking the OA into like translation by taking the occiput itself and translating it, right? We're literally taking the occiput left and right like this. I don't know if you guys can appreciate that, but we're literally going to be taking the occiput and doing this, right? Like, girlfriend, you know. That's what we're doing, right? So same thing though. Ooh, fix that. Same thing though. Flexion, translate, left and right. Extension, translate left and right. But just remember your translation rules. Translation to one side means side bending to the other, right? And we diagnose from there. All right, last but not least, how do we write OA dysfunctions, okay? So once again, we talked about translation, right? If I translate the OA to the left or right, we know what translation now, right translation, same thing as left side bending, differentiate restriction and ease for that, right? However, the OA, I can strictly tell you flex or extended, right? Or I can tell you something like this. The chin is sticking out, or the chin is tucked in. Okay? I'll tell you either one of those, right? What does it mean? Okay? What I want you to appreciate is how these terms relate to flexion and extension. Okay, so when my chin is sticking out, that's what I refer to by chin sticking out, right? Like that. Although my neck is in a level of flexion, right? I want you to appreciate the angle between my occiput and the neck, right? Notice that if I were to now straighten out my neck only, just the base of my neck, I would do this, right? So I kept this angle the same, but just straighten the base of my neck out. Notice that this is extension, right? Sticking out, right, is the same as extension, right? So this equals extension, right? Conversely, if my chin is tucked in like that, right? I know this kind of looks like it's pushing back like extension, but again, if I straighten out the base of my neck, it is flexion of the occiput on the atlas, okay? So tucked in is flexion, right? Understand that, okay? Never goes away, okay? So chin is sticking out, extension, chin is tucked in, flexion, all right? And then as long as you understand translation, the rest of the rules sort of kind of come just like everything else, right? You know, I might tell you that there is restriction in left side bending, or, you know, restriction, that's pretty much what I would decide. Restriction in translation, restriction in side bending, right? So understand these terms, right? And that'll lead you to how you to come up with a diagnosis. Now, again, with OA, how does the side bending and rotation happen? Two opposite sides, right? So if I tell you that there is restriction with the chin sticking out and in side bending to the right, right? Where is the ease, right? Well, again, chin sticking out, that's extension. That, if that's where restriction is, then the ease has to be in flexion. If the restriction is in side bending to the right, then the ease has to be in side bending to the left. So how do we write it? We say OA, we say where the ease is, flexion, and we say where the ease is in side bending first, right? So I said, I think I said restriction in side bending to the right, we would write side bending left, and we automatically know what rotation is based on the side bending because they happen to opposite sides. So there's side bending to the left, so therefore rotation has to be to the right, okay? So again, that was if I said the restriction is with chin sticking out and with side bending to the right. Okay, which means the ease is in flexion, chin tucked in, side bending to the left, and therefore rotate to the right. Okay? Everything else is just a permutation of that. Right? I could say translation, so be comfortable with translation. But in that's really all you need to know. Okay? Side bending is always written first, no matter with flexion or extension. And folks, that's really it for cervical diagnosis. Okay? So make sure you are comfortable putting your hands on people. Try and diagnose as many people as you can. Do all three types. You know, do the OA, do the AA, and do your typical cervicals. Make sure you can kind of write a diagnosis down in proper nomenclature, proper format, right? And that you can identify what the diagnosis is. If I give you all those terms, the prominent and the posterior and things like that, okay, make sure you can do all that, all right? I am going to post a similar video like this for thoracic diagnosis. It'll probably be a lot shorter because all the big concepts that we're going through here are very much repeated in thoracic, so I'm not going to go into detail. I will post a transcript for this so you guys can fast forward to the parts that you like. And with that, thank you for watching. If you got this far, I'm very impressed. And I will see you guys in class. All right.